Just before the video begins, please subscribe and like the videos to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching. By 1965, the Beatles had released their fifth studio album, Help. John said the title track was written during one of the deepest depressions he had ever had. In his words, he fought the urge to jump out of the window. A lot of these feelings came from the musical direction the Beatles were going at the time. John was also unsatisfied in his marriage and his appearance. He gained weight and later described himself as fat and depressed. For the song Help, Paul had gone to Kenwood and the pair had completed the song in a 2-hour session. A few days later, their manager Brian Epstein contacted the pair to inform them they'd be receiving an MBE. No one in the group knew what on earth he was talking about. It could be the new Aston Martin MBE for all they knew. They soon learned an MBE was an honour given by the Queen. It stood for Member of the Order of the British Empire and was usually given to senior hospital staff, headmasters and such. John joked they were receiving the reward for all the taxes they'd paid. John was embarrassed by the whole thing. The press were critical the Beatles even deserved the honour. Other MBE owners publicly stated their disgust, threatening to send their award back. One man actually followed through with it. Paul Pearson, a war hero, sent his MBE back to the Queen stating it seems to be worthless. In the meantime, the Beatles continued writing tracks for Help. Not long after the album was complete, John and George had their first experience with LSD. The drug was slipped into their coffee by a dentist they became acquainted with. George described it as something like a very concentrated version of the best feeling I've ever had in my life. John and George quickly fell in love with the drug known as lysergic acid. On their recommendation, Brian Epstein decided to take it. Not that he needed much convincing, Brian was often under the influence of one thing or another. Brian even had suits made up with small pockets on the inside, purely for the purpose of having a place to hide pills. John and George, now being regular LSD users, felt they couldn't relate to Paul and Ringo, who had yet to take the drug. They were eager for them to partake. Paul was too cautious and he had nothing to do with it. Ringo, on the other hand, was intrigued, so during a party, along with David Crosby, Peter Fonda and Roger McGuinn, he swallowed the acid-laced sugar cube. While they sat outside by the pool, a helicopter flew overhead. Dropping height, it came so close to them it made the water in the pool ripple. Knowing about the party, a group of teenage fans had rented a helicopter and wanted to see their idols up close. The entire group were at this point high on LSD and the commotion frightened George. He ran between McGuinn and Fonda. They remember him mumbling, "I feel like I'm gonna die." The rest of the group grinned and posed while the fans took pictures and waved from the helicopter. George by this point was really freaking out, so Peter Fonda attempted to calm him down. He told George, "I know what it's like to be dead." As a child, Fonda had accidentally shot himself and his heart stopped 3 times. John was half listening to the conversation and butted in, "What do you mean you know what it's like to be dead?" Fonda replied in a serious manner, "I know what it's like to be dead." John snarled, "Who put all that shit in your head?" Fonda then lifted his shirt to reveal the bullet wound. A few weeks later, the Beatles met their idol Elvis Presley. He'd finished filming his latest movie, Blue Hawaii, and was staying at a rented house in Bel Air. When the Beatles arrived, they were all laughing, partly from nerves, partly from the joints they'd smoked on the journey over. The Beatles were speechless when they first saw him, and the group sat on the sofa opposite their idol. Elvis flicked through the channels on the television set while the group sat in silence. He then declared, "If you guys are just going to sit there and stare at me, I'm going to bed." John began making awkward small talk, asking childlike questions before silence fell on the room again. Elvis then turned to his girlfriend and said, "Let's call it a night. I didn't mean for this to be like the subjects calling on the king. I just thought we'd sit and we'd talk about music and jam a little." "That'd be great," Paul blurted out. At that point the atmosphere livened up. The group began playing You're My World, followed by That's Alright Mama, and then Blue Suede Shoes. Afterwards the Beatles were quizzed by the press about their meeting. They tripped over one another in praise of their idol. Privately they felt disillusioned and disappointed. John stated, "It was a load of rubbish." After the Beatles' last performance in San Francisco, they were ready to go home. John felt nervous before the show. A fan had bitten his friend's hand, and this seemed to him a bad omen of things to come. He entered the stage to find all of the guitars were out of tune. The fans broke through the barricades and attempted to storm the stage. "Calm down," Paul shouted into the mic. "Things are getting dangerous." One kid jumped on stage and grabbed John's cap from his head before disappearing. A security guard was knocked out cold by a can of Coke and 200 fans fainted. Eventually the group had had enough and left the stage. The singles Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan and My Generation by The Who were in the charts. The new sound inspired the Beatles to be more experimental with their music. Dylan had introduced them to marijuana, now he was expanding their minds creatively. John first came up with the idea for Norwegian Wood while skiing. He sang the song in a vague oriental voice. George Martin described the song as a bitter little story. John claimed it was about an affair and written entirely by himself, though Paul later said the song was a joke on the cheap pine walls at Jane Asher's parents' house. He also added, John had no idea where the song was going when he started it. Drive My Car was a struggle to write. Paul had the tune in his head, but admitted the lyrics were disastrous. They were not satisfied with the song until they began working on it in the studio. John called the song crap, but liked the idea of "Baby You Can Drive My Car" being an innuendo. John wanted to write more personal lyrics about himself, reveal dark truths, but he wasn't ready to be so open, so he wrote in the third person. Nowhere Man is a good example of this. He wrote it high as a kite, spending 5 hours to attempting to write a song that was meaningful and good. He stated, "I felt of myself as this nowhere man sitting in this nowhere land." When Paul heard the song, he felt it was a statement about John's marriage. John abandoned the third person narrative and spoke directly from the heart when he wrote In My Life. John claimed he wrote the song entirely himself, but Paul stated by the time they'd reworked it, very few of John's original lyrics remained. Paul also claimed he wrote the whole melody. I'm looking through you laid bare Paul's frustrations with Jane Asher. And the album closed with Run for Your Life, a song John hated. George Martin later stated, "For the first time we began to think of albums as art, as complete entities." They originally planned the new album to be titled Plastic Soul, but eventually settled on Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul raised the bar and made musicians reconsider how they wrote and recorded songs. The album blended a style of country music, gospel, and French ballads. John at this time devoured all the daily newspapers and spent the days watching hours of daytime television. Ringo spent his time doting on his family. A friend said nothing made him more happy than sitting in the kitchen eating cornflakes with Maureen. Paul became heavily involved in the art scene and began taking piano lessons. Among famous artists like Andy Warhol, his celebrity meant nothing. George was heavily involved with Indian music and his new friend Ravi Shankar. He stated, "Sometimes before I go to sleep, I imagine what it would be like to be in Ravi's sitar." George and Patty were married at this time, Brian Epstein and Paul McCartney served as best men. John wrote a song about the story Peter Fonda had told George. She Said was the final product. He also wrote a song called Dr. Robert about a doctor who prescribed his patients recreational drugs under the guise of legit medical practice. It contained the most blatant drug references in a Beatles song to date. John claimed he wrote the bulk of the song, with Paul contributing the "Well, well, well, you're feeling fine" bridge. He'd been inspired to write the song after hearing the Rolling Stones' Mother's Little Helper. I'm Only Sleeping was the first psychedelic track John ever wrote, though originally he wrote it about his love of staying in bed rather than drug euphoria. Lennon spent so much time in bed he had to be woken by McCartney for their songwriting sessions. A friend of John said, "He can sleep indefinitely. He's probably the laziest person in England." Paul wrote Good Day Sunshine during a sunny day at John's house. He later said the song was basically mine and John had little input. Lennon confirmed the song was Paul's, stating he maybe threw a line in or two. Got to Get You Into My Life was Paul's love letter to marijuana. Starting as a very basic song, it evolved massively in the studio. Similarly, George's song I Want to Tell You was about the emotions brought on by LSD. Not a love letter, but a criticism on the awkward feelings brought on. The fade in and the awkwardly timed lyrics reflect this. George's next song, Love You Too, was a love song to his wife Patty, and Taxman expressed a fear the group's tax obligations would lead to their bankruptcy. The group at this point were obsessed with the idea of great sounding whole albums. They felt that's where the English lacked and the Americans excelled. Abbey Road Studios at this time, as far as technical practices were concerned, was still in the dark ages. Engineers even advised group against being creative. They called it tampering with the music. George and John even considered relocating and recording in Memphis, Tennessee, but they changed their mind and Abbey Road was booked. After Revolver was released, the group retired from touring. This revelation depressed Brian Epstein. By this point, Brian was a physical and emotional mess, no matter how much he tried to hide it. Brian was on a cocktail of drugs and he wondered where his place would be now the Beatles had quit live performance. Before he had much time to think, he received a phone call from his office in London. His colleague on the other end told him John had made some comments about Christianity. "You better get on top of this," she said, "because shit has hit the fan." "We're more popular now than Jesus" was the quote that started the burning of Beatles records. The first mass burning occurred in Birmingham, Alabama. The sentiment, "they can't get away with this sort of thing," was preached. Some radio stations in the Deep South burned their Beatles collections, and the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan nailed several Beatle albums to a cross and set it alight. Brian brushed it off publicly, calling it a storm in a teacup, but nevertheless a trip to the States was arranged. Brian arranged a public apology, but John refused, stating, "I have nothing to apologise for." Brian read a public apology for him. It took place in a suite at New York's Americana Hotel. In a statement, he mentioned the quote was taken deeply out of context and that Lennon is deeply interested in religion and didn't mean to boast about the Beatles' fame. A statement by Brian Epstein wasn't enough. Demands for Lennon to apologise grew publicly. Lennon refused. Brian was in the process of negotiating future royalty deals for their songs and also a new contract with EMI which would raise their finances dramatically. Brian reminded John it wasn't just his riches he was compromising, it was the whole group's. With that, John agreed to apologise. The event was booked at the Astor Towers in Chicago. Before the event started, John burst into tears. Never one for confrontation, the pressure had been too much for him. Once he composed himself, the press conference began. Paul later said he'd never seen John so nervous, like he was facing the press for the first time. In the statement, looking very shaken, John apologised for his words, stating, "I'm not anti-God, anti-Christ, or anti-religion." And with that, as far as the press were concerned, the case was closed. The US tour went on with threats of violence and an uneasy feeling amongst the group. Before one show, George joked, "Send John out first, he's the one they want." As the tour wrapped up, John felt dreadful. "I didn't want to tour again," he later said, "especially after being accused of crucifying Jesus." The whole band in reality was sick of touring. The year Sgt. Pepper was made, George was heavily using cocaine. He'd also succumbed to peer pressure and had taken LSD for the first time. While on vacation, Paul had disguised himself and thought, "Why can't the Beatles do this too?" He later stated, "I thought, let's not be ourselves, let's develop alter egos." He came up with the name Sgt. Pepper while on a plane looking at sachets of salt and pepper. He simply changed the salt to Sergeant. The idea of appearing as a fictional band for the next album was put forward to the other members. The notion confused them. Paul told them, "We'll be Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and for the whole album we'll pretend to be someone else." George was the least enthusiastic. He'd been using acid for a while and was growing out of it. This idea had come a year or so late for him. George even went so far as to say they were going backwards. During the sessions, Harrison's role as lead guitarist was limited. John's song Strawberry Fields Forever was to be the first song written for the album, followed shortly after by Paul's song Penny Lane. Neither would appear on Pepper. David Crosby and Mick Jagger visited Abbey Road while sessions were in place. The studio became like a clubhouse. The song Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band opened the album with Paul welcoming the audience to the band's 20th anniversary concert. The song ends with Paul introducing Billy Shears, which was the character played by Ringo. This shortly followed by "With a Little Help from My Friends." Lennon later said, "All my contributions have absolutely nothing to do with Sgt. Pepper and his band." Getting Better contains Lennon's most open lyrics to date. They read, "I used to be cruel to my woman and beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved." Fixing a Hole details McCartney's desire to let his creative ideas flow without self-critique. She's Leaving Home tells the story of a young woman escaping her controlling parents, sung by McCartney's perspective as the child and Lennon's as the parent. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, Lennon wrote using words from a circus poster. No great meaning behind this song, Lennon just needed to fill out the album. Within You Without You featured Harrison and none of the other group. The track ends with laughter. Harrison later said, "It served as a reminder the audience are still in the background listening to Sgt. Pepper and his band perform." When I'm 64 borrowed heavily from the style of George Formby. It was aimed at an older generation, maybe the generation mentioned in She's Leaving Home. Lovely Rita was wrote as a comedic song. Paul falling in love with a woman while she was writing him up for a ticket for illegally parking. John wrote Good Morning after watching an advert for Kellogg's cornflakes. It depicts a bored working class man fantasizing about a different life, becoming a different person in his imagination. The song was followed up by a reprise of the opening track, with Paul saying goodbye to the audience. The final song seems detached from the album. Sgt. Pepper's band have gone, and now the narrator, possibly one of the members in Sgt. Pepper's band, mourns the death of his bandmate who's committed suicide. The psychedelic vocals suggest he's under the influence while thinking about this before falling asleep. The song then switches to a dream sequence. The man's problems disappear, his only issue now being he's running late for work. The song goes back into the trippy vocals before ending with a big build-up to a final climax, perhaps the narrator reliving the gunshot in his head. The album was released to commercial and critical acclaim. To say it was a masterpiece would be a fair comment, arguably the best album of all time. Not long afterwards, Brian Epstein would die of a drug overdose, leaving the group directionless. Pepper marked the peak of their career, and from then on, things seemed uncertain.
I knew that we were in trouble then. I didn't really have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music. I was scared, I thought, we've f***ing had it now.